There is a quiet storm that brews in the depths of the human soul, an unspoken tremor of vulnerability, a gnawing sense of being adrift in a world that demands strength while withholding the map to find it. This is the psychology of powerlessness, a terrain Carl Jung navigated with unflinching honesty, peeling back the layers of our collective and individual illusions to reveal a truth as brutal as it is liberating. Powerlessness is not merely the absence of control, but a confrontation with the shadow self, the uncharted caverns of our psyche where fear and potential wage an eternal war. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, moonlit forest. The trees loom like ancient sentinels, their roots tangled in the soil of forgotten myths and buried desires. To step forward is to acknowledge that you are lost. To turn back is to remain forever haunted by the whispers of what could have been. Jung's insights into powerlessness are not a diagnosis of weakness, but an invitation to this very forest, a call to wander into the darkness where the self is both the prisoner and the key. In a world obsessed with dominance, productivity, and the illusion of invulnerability, powerlessness is often treated as a flaw to be eradicated, a glitch in the system of the ideal self. But Jung's brutal truth is that powerlessness is, paradoxically, the threshold of transformation. It is the moment when the ego's fortress crumbles, revealing the raw, untamed wilderness of the unconscious. Here, in this liminal space, we encounter the archetypes that shape us. The wounded healer, the orphan, the rebel, the sage, each a fragment of the greater story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we deserve. To explore this psychology is to dance with paradox, the surrender that leads to empowerment, the disintegration that births wholeness. It is to recognize that powerlessness is not the enemy, but the dark womb from which true agency emerges. The journey is not for the faint of heart, for it demands that we stare into the abyss of our own fragility and, in doing so, discover that the abyss is not empty. It is alive with the echoes of every version of ourselves we have ever been and have yet to become. At the heart of Jung's exploration of powerlessness lies a paradox so profound it bends the mind. The very thing we resist, the sensation of being unmoored, helpless, at the mercy of forces beyond our control, is the crucible in which the self is remade. This is not the passive resignation of defeat, but an active, almost sacred confrontation with the parts of ourselves we have exiled in the name of strength. Jung's framework reveals that powerlessness is not a void, but a hidden dialogue between the conscious and unconscious. A tug-of-war between the persona we present to the world and the shadow we bury in shame. One of the central pillars of this psychology is the concept of the shadow, the repository of all we deny, suppress, or deem unacceptable. When we feel powerless, it is often because the shadow has erupted into our awareness, dragging with it the buried fears, unmet needs, and unhealed wounds we've spent a lifetime avoiding. The ego, that diligent gatekeeper of identity, interprets this eruption as a threat, a destabilizing force. But Jung's brutal truth is that the shadow is not an enemy. It is a teacher. Powerlessness, then, becomes the moment when the soul demands an audience with the self, forcing us to listen to the whispers we've drowned out with distractions, achievements, or the illusion of control. Another critical theme is the archetype of the wounded healer, embodied in figures like Chiron, the immortal centaur who could not heal his own suffering but became a guide for others. This archetype speaks to the transformative potential of powerlessness, the idea that our deepest fractures are also the places where wisdom enters. To be powerless is to stand at the crossroads of victimhood and sovereignty, where the choice is not to escape the pain but to alchemize it. Jung's work suggests that true empowerment does not come from dominating our circumstances, but from integrating our vulnerabilities, allowing them to become part of our wholeness rather than evidence of our brokenness. Finally, there is the collective dimension of powerlessness, the way it mirrors larger societal and cultural currents. In an age that glorifies individualism and relentless productivity, the admission of powerlessness is taboo, a silent shame. Yet Jung reminds us that this very disconnection from our fragility is what fuels collective illusions of invincibility, leading to the repression of empathy, the denial of interdependence, and the perpetuation of systems that thrive on our alienation from ourselves. To reclaim power, then, is not to ascend above our humanity but to descend into it, to touch the raw nerve of our shared vulnerability and discover, in that darkness, a kind of kinship, an unspoken solidarity with all who have ever stood at the edge of their own abyss and dared to look in. Myths and dreams are the language of the unconscious, and in their labyrinthine symbolism, we find echoes of Jung's brutal truth about powerlessness. Consider the ancient tale of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess who descends into the underworld, stripped of her jewels, her crown, and finally her very flesh, until she stands naked and broken before her dark sister, Ereshkigal. This is no mere story of defeat. It is an allegory of initiation. Inanna's powerlessness is not her end, but her rebirth. She must surrender every layer of her identity to pass through the gates of the underworld. And in that surrender, she discovers a sovereignty far deeper than the superficial power she once wielded. Jung would recognize this journey instantly. The ego, like Inanna, must be dismantled before the self can be remade. Then there is the alchemical process of nigredo, the blackening, where base matter is reduced to its primordial state, a chaotic, formless mass that seems devoid of value. To the untrained eye, it is pure destruction. But the alchemists understood it as the necessary first step toward transformation. So too with the psyche. When we are plunged into the nigredo of powerlessness, when relationships crumble, when purpose evaporates, when the body or mind betrays us, we are not being punished. We are being dissolved. The old structures of meaning must decay so that something more resilient can emerge. Jung saw this as a universal pattern. Darkness precedes dawn, chaos births order, and the feeling of being utterly lost is often the prelude to finding a true path. Even nature whispers this truth. The caterpillar's dissolution in the chrysalis is not a graceful metamorphosis but a near-total liquefaction. A cellular unraveling that looks, for all intents and purposes, like death. Yet from this soup of disintegration, wings form. The creature that could only crawl is remade into one that can fly. Here, the symbolism is unmistakable. Powerlessness is not the opposite of transformation. It is its raw material. The ego clings to the safety of the ground, but the soul knows that to become what we are meant to be, we must first endure the terror of the in-between, that liminal space where nothing is certain and everything is possible. These narratives are not escapist fantasies. They are maps. They show us that the anguish of powerlessness has always been part of the human journey, not as a flaw to be remedied, but as a sacred passage. The question is not how to avoid the descent, but how to meet it. Will we rage against the stripping away of our illusions? Or will we, like Inanna, let the underworld do its work? Will we see the nigredo as a curse, or as the first stirrings of gold in the alchemist's flask? The symbols are clear. What feels like an ending is often the unseen beginning of a story too vast for the uninitiated to comprehend. To translate Jung's insights from the realm of myth into the pulse of daily existence is to recognize that powerlessness is not some abstract philosophical dilemma. It is the quiet tremor in your hands when faced with a decision you cannot control, the hollow ache of grief that refuses to be rationalized away, the frustration of societal systems that seem designed to remind you of your smallness. The challenge, then, is not to transcend these feelings but to mine them for their hidden potency. Imagine a potter at the wheel. The clay resists, slips, collapses under unskilled hands. Yet the artisan knows that this resistance is not failure. It is dialogue. So too with powerlessness. It is the psyche's way of signaling where we are being called to grow, where our old ways of being no longer serve us. Consider the simple act of setting boundaries, an often misunderstood exercise of power. Many assume that to be powerful is to never need boundaries, to be impervious to the demands of others. But Jung's framework reveals the opposite. True strength emerges when we acknowledge our limits. The person who can say no from a place of self-awareness, rather than guilt or fear, is not contracting their world but expanding it. They are no longer fighting the exhaustion of overextension, no longer pouring from an empty cup. This is powerlessness transformed into agency, not through domination, but through discernment. Similarly, in moments of collective uncertainty, economic instability, political unrest, environmental crises, The Jungian approach does not advocate for blind optimism or passive despair, but for the courage to stand in the tension, to ask, what is this revealing about what we've ignored? What shadows are being forced into the light? Even the rituals of modern life can become vessels for this integration. Therapy, journaling, meditation. These are not mere self-help tools but contemporary forms of alchemy. When you sit with a therapist and articulate a long-buried shame, you are performing your own nigredo, breaking down the leaden weight of silence into something malleable. When you meditate and observe your thoughts without judgment, you are practicing the art of holding the tension between opposites. The very process Jung believed was necessary for psychological growth. And in the mundane, the act of pausing before reacting in anger, of choosing curiosity over defensiveness when criticized, of allowing yourself to rest without guilt. These are the microscopic rebellions against the tyranny of false power. The societal implications run even deeper. In a culture that equates worth with productivity, admitting fragility is revolutionary. Movements that embrace vulnerability, from mental health advocacy to disability justice, are not signs of societal weakness but of collective maturation. They echo Jung's insistence that the way forward is not to deny our shadows but to integrate them. When a community acknowledges its historical wounds instead of burying them, when leaders admit fallibility rather than clinging to the facade of infallibility, they are embodying the very principles that transform powerlessness from a liability into a crucible for change. The systems that fear this vulnerability are the ones that crumble under their own rigidity, while those that adapt, that honor the full spectrum of human experience, are the ones that endure. Jung's brutal truth about powerlessness is, ultimately, a radical affirmation. You are not broken because you feel powerless. You are human. And in that humanity lies an intelligence far older and wiser than the ego's frantic attempts to control, to perfect, to outrun discomfort. The call here is not to overcome powerlessness but to let it initiate you, to allow it to strip away the illusions of separateness, superiority, and invulnerability that keep you from your own depths. This is not a passive surrender but an active collaboration with the self. Imagine standing again at that forest's edge, the one from the introduction. This time, you know the trees are not there to frighten you but to remind you of the cyclical nature of all things. The decay that feeds the roots, the darkness that cradles the seed. You understand now that powerlessness is not the absence of light but the soil in which new light takes root. The transformational question is no longer how do I escape this, but what is this here to teach me? So here is the invitation. The next time you feel the ground give way beneath you, do not scramble for the solidity of old certitudes. Pause, breathe, ask what part of you is being called to the surface. Reach for the wisdom of the wounded healer, the resilience of the alchemist, the courage of Inanna in her descent. And remember, the night is not your enemy. It is the womb. The dawn is already stirring within it.